Welcome back to Enter the Sandbox. Today we're going to be taking on policies and budgets, and specifically in the early game stages, which is where Ridgewater is really kind of right now still. While, we have thrown some population in 5,500 and, our budget is healthy. It doesn't mean that it can't be better, more targeted, more isolated. And in the last episode of Ridgewater, I carved out districts, mainly just for distribution and naming and boundary lines, and and we're not really leveraging what districts actually exist to do. So today, we're going to wipe them off the map, and we're going to rebuild our districts and work with the policies and dive into the budget. First, I'm going to start off just by wiping it clean. Our policies start with services. Now, I am at 5,500 residents. I'm sure you noticed that everything's unlocked. I have went in for this episode specifically into Game Anarchy and unlocked all policies so we can review. But that doesn't really change what we're going to go over today as far as early game. And normally taxation would be locked out at this stage, and city planning would be missing a lot of, quite a few of them. Small business, industrial space, high-tech housing, all those aren't really available at this stage. But take a look at our budget panel real quick. So, we're sitting pretty reasonable here too. A lot of that has to do with our industry area. It's pretty fine-tuned at this point and is bringing in good profit, but there is fluctuations in that, and that's where we can kind of hopefully squeeze a little bit more out at the policy level. So let's just jump right in and take a look at our services, which I think the first one that I'd like to approach in this is the Smoke Detector Distribution. So that does exactly what it sounds like. Significantly reduced risk of fire. The difference is where you can kind of get tracked because it sounds great. Let's just throw the whole thing on, but that throws it on to citywide, and that's basically five units per building, and that really adds up, and that really takes a hit to your budget pretty quickly. So let's just take a look at our fire coverage here real quick. So internally, we're in pretty reasonable shape. Here's our two fire departments. But out here in our industrial, our farming, and the rest is kind of outskirts. The high school and the apartment complex over here are a little hurt, but really overall, our inner town network is pretty well taken care of. So I think where we'll start is let's just go ahead and put a district out here around the industrial complex. Go ahead and throw a smoke detector distribution policy on this. So that will definitely help us where we're kind of hurting out here on the outskirts of town. So let's think about where else our fire coverage is probably lacking or harder to get to. And for me, that would be the farm. And the building count, in this specialized industry isn't very high, so it's not going to really cost us a lot per building to go ahead and enact that and help out the town. And then we can go ahead and throw smoke detector on it. And then technically this is kind of hurting in our fire coverage zone too. I think we could probably go ahead and throw it out here too. And I think even with other policies that we'll enact throughout the rest of this episode, this probably isn't really a bad combination of a district. If we need to change it, we will, but let's go ahead and throw that on to start. So let's take a look at a few other of our service city policies. and see what else is a benefit, what hurts, what helps, and a few to kind of look at and test and create. So recreational use is an interesting one. So it does what it sounds like it does. It's controlled substances, attracts more tourists, but we could test it in a commercial district if we want to carve out basically Main Street. We could see if that helps us. We can take a quick look at citizen happiness. So 88, 77 on commercial, 78 on office. Industrial's quite happy at 96. So commercial is lower, and we could see if maybe this policy could kind of bump us up just a little bit. So let's go ahead and try recreational use on it and see what we can maybe get from it. Now, from there, you do have an education boost, which from an early game standpoint can be a little bit of a trap, because you don't really have your offices, your high-tech jobs, or your true need of an educated workforce, because typically you're like where Ridgewater is sitting right now, you're sitting with an elementary school and a high school, so you don't really have your full pipeline running as far as college and the next levels of education. Now, in the flip side of that, you have schools out. And this one will keep you from going too overeducated, and is better for your workforce labor. So I think that would make this little pocket of housing right here, which in the Ridgewater series was a workforce housing intent. So cut off the education boost for right here, and let's go with schools out, because that will give us a 693 population completely beside our farm that's dedicated to not being kind of that overeducated aspect. So, and it looks like I accidentally put the education boost on all of the available. So, but there are definitely a few budget traps in this side. So, one definitely being power usage. So it's, 5 units per building, and, you go citywide on that, which we can enact it and see what starts to happen to our budget. And kind of while that's taking hold a little bit, we'll go ahead and kind of wrap out historic core of Ridgewater here and take care of the rest of the current population, which is sitting at about 2,000 of the 5,500. So, and then I'd say our other budget traps are going to be water usage and recycling. While they sound great, they typically cost you a lot more than what it is just to build out facilities or upgrade a water pump station. So it's kind of hard to look at that one and think that it's very useful. Right now our policies are costing us $6,500, and so that's taken a huge chunk out of our profit margin and makes the city's ability to expand and grow at a faster rate a little bit more difficult, and quite a bit more difficult. Granted, Ridgewater is sitting in a healthy place to drive in high income at the moment, but so now that we've seen how fast policies like power and water usage eat into our cash flow, let's look at the breakdown of the major service policies to see which ones are actually worth enacting early. The first policy category is services. This is where a lot of early game traps show up because many of these policies charge per building. That sounds manageable when the town is small, but as the district grows, the cost scales across every building affected by the policy. Water usage and power usage are the easiest examples. They reduce consumption, but in the early game, adding capacity directly is usually cheaper than paying a recurring charge on every building. Recycling has the same problem, only worse. It reduces garbage production, but the upkeep is expensive and the commercial penalty makes it a poor early game trade. If garbage is the issue, direct garbage infrastructure is usually the cleaner answer. The standout in this category is Smoke Detector Distribution. For industrial areas, dense commercial blocks, and districts sitting outside the ideal fire coverage, this policy can reduce fire risk before the city needs perfect fire coverage everywhere. Free public transport is more nuanced. Early on, losing ticket revenue can hurt, but later, in a district with real traffic pressure, it can become a targeted traffic relief tool. Educational boosts and schools out are both useful, but for the opposite reasons. Educational boost helps when the city is moving toward offices, high-tech jobs, and more educated workers. Schools out helps when the city still needs uneducated labor for generic industry, farming, and other workforce-heavy districts. So the services category is not about turning everything on. It's about avoiding the per-building money pits and using the few strong policies where they solve a real local problem. City planning policies definitely are kind of the same catch-22 in a sense. There's some great ones, there's some trap ones, and there's some highly isolated ones. So I think the easiest one just to pop right out is encourage biking. You can go citywide on it. Even if you don't have bike lanes, it's still going to take some of the short trips off the roadways. Which is going to help your traffic flow. Even if it's in the most marginal way possible, it's going to help out. So we'll enact that. And now, heavy traffic ban is also an interesting one. I don't want to enact it citywide, but I do think enacting it in some of this. See, we have the farm coming off here, and instead of coming out to the collector to leave, we do have a certain amount of delivery trucks cutting through the neighborhood to get to Main Street, where they could have went up and over. So I do think that this particular district right here has a pretty strong case for the heavy traffic ban. That one will help out, though, keep this neighborhood cleaner and keep a lot of our delivery trucks and of course it'll keep freight out altogether. But it'll actually put the traffic back out to the roads they're intended to be on. Freight routes isolated and heavy traffic banned from some of the local streets. Let's break down the rest of the primary planning tools to see how they stack up for the early game layout control. The second policy category is city planning. This is where policies become real layout control. Heavy traffic ban is one of the strongest tools in the game when it is used correctly. It does not delete freight traffic, and it does not affect highways, but it can also stop trucks from cutting through residential streets, downtown districts, or Main Street corridors when they do not belong there. Freight still needs a route, so the goal is not to remove trucks. The goal is to push them toward industrial roads, collectors, and highway access instead of letting them wander through neighborhoods. Encourage biking is also extremely strong because it is free and reduces local vehicle demand. Every short trip that becomes a bike trip is one less car adding pressure to the road network. Bike ban on sidewalks is more of a utility policy. It makes sense when the town has a dedicated bike infrastructure and you want bicycles separated from pedestrian space. Old Town is another powerful district tool. It prevents outside traffic from using a district as a shortcut, which makes it useful for historic downtowns, quiet residential grids, or older Main Street areas that serve local access instead of through traffic. Combustion engine ban is a late game tool. It can reduce noise and clean up dense areas, but only once the city has developed enough for that restriction to make sense. Highrise ban is different. That is not really an efficiency policy, it is a realism policy. It lets the city use higher zoning intensity without letting the skyline break the town's profile. High-tech housing can push land value, but is expensive enough that it should not be treated as a casual early game toggle. The commercial and industrial policies are where the trade-off gets serious. Small business enthusiasts and big business benefactor can strengthen commercial performance, but they can also increase goods demand and freight pressure. Industrial space planning can boost production, but that extra output still has to move through the road network. And Industry 4.0 changes the labor profile, so it makes more sense once the city has the education base to support it. So city planning is probably the strongest policy category overall, but it is also the category most likely to reshape traffic behavior, district identity, industrial output, and the way the town actually functions. Okay, so that brings us to the taxation city policies. This is another one that hits at the small city milestone. This one's tough for me. It's good for highly isolated. If you have your taxes already set at 12%, and then you enact tax raises, you're definitely, while you might get a small bump in revenue, you can also drive your happiness down, drive to abandonment, and then kind of flush out what you're trying to do. Tax relief now, on the other hand, though, being the exact opposite. If you have some demand issues, and or anything like that, and you want to highly target a location, hey, that's definitely easier than messing with your global panel and still giving tax reliefs for certain isolated pockets of commercial or residential or industrial. So, once again, that's one of those highly isolated, specific use cases, that I don't really look at any of these as being very strong for global. Now, for that same aspect, Ridgewater is already sitting at 12%, but just for experimentation purposes, and since we're currently in the middle of seeing how our budget reacts to a mass policy move and having some on a global level that are highly costly, we can take a look at a couple here. Let's see, tax. Let's go out here and we'll throw a tax raise on residential. So that should essentially bump it to 14%, and they really won't like that eventually. And we can throw it here too while we're speeding up to see how people react to it. Okay, so now we definitely can see after a little bit of runtime that that's where the maybe not happiness dropped quite dramatically across the board. So we went from about 87 to 81, and we're definitely taking our taxes are too high warnings. So that's just definitely, to me, it's easier to apply globally and to really kind of more use the tax relief side of it for very isolated attacks on demand meters and happiness meters and kind of those use cases in a sense. So we'll give a little tax relief to make them happy, since we just angered the population. Now that we've seen how the engine reacts when taxes push past the safe limit, let's step over to our breakdown of the 12% tax rule and how to use tax relief properly. The final policy category is taxation. This one is simpler, but it matters because the budget decides whether any policy is actually affordable. The main rule is the 12% rule. In city skylines, taxes generally can be raised to 12% without seriously damaging growth or happiness. That makes 12% the early game baseline for stable revenue. Above that, the risk changes. Pushing taxes too high can reduce demand, lower happiness, and eventually create abandonment pressure. Tax raise policies can generate more revenue for a specific zone type, but they should not be treated as free money. If the city is already sitting near the safe tax limit, pushing higher becomes a short-term lever with long-term risk. Tax relief is the opposite tool. It can stimulate a specific zone type when demand stalls, but it is also a direct revenue loss. That means it should be temporary and targeted, not something left on forever because it sounds pro-growth. So taxation policy is not complicated. Raise taxes to the safe limit, stabilize the budget, and use relief only when a specific district or zone type needs a temporary push. Alright, so now we're kind of back to the budget side of things, and we can see the hit that our policy and acting kind of took, and it's really kind of put us on the brink a little bit on being profitable versus riding the line. And and it's fine to take those brief moments of trying to accomplish something from a citizen happiness standpoint, to tourism, to anything like that you might need some isolated bumps. Overall, I think from a citywide perspective, we definitely can come in here and kick these highly costly ones off. And kick education boost off too. We don't really necessarily need it. But that's also the interesting part. While we went ahead and put on a relief and dropped them, it really didn't affect our overall residential happiness too much. So, it's, to me, setting at the global is kind of where you want to be with it. So let's jump into our budget panel and take a look and see. We already went down 6,000 units, and and that's a comfortable range of where I want to see the city at this size spending on isolated, targeted policy usage, and ones that really can show you some benefit, either isolated or global, and really kind of get your bang for your buck. Because pushing 7,000 units there is not a good bang for the buck. We're just kind of draining our surpluses that really promote our growth and our ability to spend, and and the ability to put in stuff like this town pool that is incredibly costly on the budget. So we'll jump in here and see what we have kind of overages on. So okay, so power, we have a little bit here. We're not paying a whole lot for it though, so I don't know how much we're gonna really benefit from the drop. Maybe 90 without concerning yourself too much as you're building, because I really, this is one of those moments where you're not going to do a huge savings for what it's worth. Now, if we had a massive surplus, that's really where it pays off. Water, we do have a pretty good surplus, but we don't have a very good surplus in sewage, so there's not a whole lot of movement we can do here without putting ourselves in a little trouble on the sewage side. And we can see that every few bucks, if you're running super tight, it does make a difference. Trash, we actually can drop probably reasonably substantially and still be pretty comfortable. Yeah. So maybe even 75. Now, one aspect to it though you do have to be careful is we did just lose a lot of coverage. While we have the processing capability, where now a lot of these are custom assets, they do have a little bit more growth, but it's from a realistic standpoint in this particular build is why it's working like that. So that actually hurt us in the sense that I'm fine with the budget taking the hit and providing better care. So, and see, we're back up to covering what it needs to cover for this particular town. So we'll leave that one alone. Now, healthcare, it's the same across the board. Now, the real interesting one is the day-night cycle, which I'm sure a lot of people play both ways. Crime at night, of course, it kind of peaks up. So We can move that to 101. And the 101 is kind of really where you benefit the most from. And so we have nine in this firehouse. And we're at night. So let's bump it back to 100. And we have 8. So for just the 1%, we get an extra truck. And that is kind of that sweet spot. Jamming it up to 150, it sounds like it would really help, but you don't really get the 50% based on how the actual algorithm treats that. So, we could jam that thing through the roof. Now we're at 150%, taking a bigger hit on our budget. And I guess realistically, we needed to have jammed that thing up at nighttime. And see, our power is already kind of stressed out sitting here at nighttime. So we have 10 fire trucks in this station from being completely maxed up at 150% versus the 101, and we still have just one less. So there's really not a big financial sense. Now that works across anything that distributes high level vehicles and stuff like that. And so that's just kind of a good place to kind of hang around when you need that little extra bump. And 50%, dropping things to 50% as well too. It doesn't really mean 50% service. It kind of cuts that output down to 37.5%. So services do collapse quicker, and it's hard to justify the savings from it. So let's get back to daytime. And so now that we've kind of tested adjusting service budgets and how it impacts the city, we can step over to the budget review card and break down the cost versus output scaling rules. The fourth technical layer is budget control. This is not technically a policy category, but it controls whether the city can afford the policies it uses. And the most important thing to understand is that budget sliders do not scale evenly. A 50% budget does not give you 50% service output. Because of the game's penalty formula below 100%, a 50% budget cuts actual service output down to roughly 37.5%. That makes severe budget cuts a major trap. You lose over 60% of your service capacity to save only half the cost. The 100% budget point is the baseline. That is the normal cost for normal output. But the other side has the opposite problem. At 150% budget, the city pays 50% more upkeep but only gets about 25% more service output. That's why 150% is usually a money pit. If a service gap is real, another building is usually cleaner than brute forcing the slider. The best efficiency point is the 101% trick. For vehicle-based services, moving the budget from 100 to 101% can sometimes round the available vehicle count up by 1. This works best on buildings with larger baseline vehicle fleets, where that tiny increase crosses the rounding threshold. So for fire, police, garbage, and medical services, 101% can be the high value setting, a small cost increase for a meaningful operational gain. Day and night budgets are another useful control. Schools and transit can often run lower at night when demand is reduced, while police may need to stay closer to full funding. And in the very early game, power and water can sometimes run below 100% when capacity is far above actual demand. But that should be temporary. The rule is not to starve services forever. The rule is to match funding to real demand. So the budget lesson is simple. Do not use 150% sliders to solve structural service gaps. Use 101% where it creates extra vehicles. Cut only when excess capacity is obvious. And when the city truly needs more services, place another service node. I think that is a realistic look at early game policy use. Not a full policy encyclopedia, but a practical breakdown of what helps the budget, what hurts the budget, and how to start using these tools more efficiently. For this stage of the city growth, the important thing is not turning on every policy that sounds useful. It is understanding what actually serves the population, the layout, and the budget before committing the city to that cost. So I hope this Enter the Sandbox episode gave you something useful to take back into your own city. If you have thoughts on policies I missed or ideas for future deep dives, let me know. And I'll see you in the next Enter the Sandbox episode.